Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Constructive Criticism Podcast. I'm coming from to you from House, Valerian, joined by my co-host, that's Abe Stein, coming to you from House Targaryen. How's it going, man?
I have no idea what you're saying right now, Spencer, and I love you for it.
That's totally great, but Mason's coming to us from Hightower, and
everyone thought the show sucked. And like the new season, the thing sucked, and then suddenly on social media, everyone was so hyped, and I was like, "Dog, I thought we all thought it was like mid plus. What's going on?" And
really?
Then I see New York has the dragon on the Empire State Building, and they put the flags over the bridge, and it's. I feel like this is my Mandela moment, where it's like I'm in the timeline where everyone thought it was mid, and then I'm in the timeline where everyone's like House of Dragons.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know, Mason. Sorry, I think television and Magic work in opposite cycles. Like in Magic, everyone kind of like gives up, and then they're like, "Oh, like I don't know, there's too much going on, and I don't like it." But like, and there's always more content. In TV, we get to a point where it's like there is nothing. Yeah, there is nothing, and then we'll give anything a chance.
To be fair, HBO is smart to like run a show like this during the summer because it means that all the network television shows are like done. So,
do you watch a lot of network like NBC dramas?
I don't anymore. I don't watch network television much anymore.
I just literally came up at Sunday Modern yesterday, where I joked about how Netflix was suggesting the hit show Evil to me, and it's actually kind of nice, whatever. But like, I don't know, just it feels like people used to always watch stuff like that. And what was that one show that everyone loved about the family that was like flashbacks? Like it was on Sunday. I don't know. Just feels like a different era in television. The Boys is great. That's where I'm at.
Boy, that's not network television.
I know. Network television is dead. Long live Amazon Prime's The Boys.
Let's go. I think that television has just improved, is what the real truth is. And, a few years ago, we talked about, people were talking about like the golden age of television. Well, I think this is the golden age of CCMTG because we get to talk about improving every week. And Mason, you get to do it first. What was your always improving movie this week?
Wow. My always improving segment this week comes from really trying out a lot of the stuff that I didn't like about some decks, and specifically in mono green. Just kind of trying to, make sure that like I have biases and thoughts, but like, stuff like the Leyline of the Guild Packs and the Sunken Citadels are two things that like I think really just take the deck in a different direction, one that I'm not a huge fan of. But I wanted to try them, give them a shot, and that's what was improving kind of came from this week was like, hey, I don't really like this, but I have access to these cards, I like this deck, I should give this another try. It's doing so well, there's probably something to it. And yeah, that was my most improving segment.
Did you have conclusions?
I kind of don't hate the Leyline of the Guild Pact build that doesn't have Sunken Citadel, but I think Sunken Citadel goes so well with Leyline because it gives you essentially more elf into Nykthos draws by going like Leyline, play a Citadel, play Nykthos, now you're at 4 mana on turn 2. And it doesn't give you that like 5 mana play that's so powerful of like turn 1 Leyline Elf into turn 2 Nykthos Kiora, and then untap and then play like a Storm is just so much mana. And obviously that's like like a 5 or 6 card combo I talked about, but like your deck is very redundant and it's good at doing stuff. So I don't know. I'm in a weird spot where I'm trying to figure out like how much do I really like Sunken Citadel and enabling these faster draws, and am I going to lean into that? Because I guess I should say explosive draws. I've been faster.
I would say, Mason, that a piece of green advice for me is that like really the answer to that question is always going to be tied to the decks around it, right? Like if your elves are safer, the Citadel stuff gets worse. And if your elves are less in danger, then the Citadel stuff... the more danger your elves are in, the better the Citadel stuff gets.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that, like, Pioneer, unless it needs, like, a huge banning for that to change. Does that make sense? But people are still... there'll still be times where it ebbs and flows, right? So it's just interesting, kind of, like, do I even think is worth the benefit of, like, you have those explosive starts, but only if you have those kind of like Nykthos, Leyline, and that. And obviously it's very nice with Castle, it's very nice with Nykthos on going off with turns, but it slows you down and curving out off the top. And I think that is important. Like I've put a lot of green games where you kind of like get ahead a little bit and you're just like top decking, trying to find a land to like, storm and stabilize. And having tap lands really affects that. So I don't know. It is weird. I agree with what you're saying, but it's like even beyond like the macro of like, where is it, and more into the micro, like nitty gritty stuff. You know what I mean? Abe, what's your always improving segment this week?
Yeah, so my always improving moment this week comes from playing a Modern Horizons 3 sealed RCQ over the weekend. I actually came into the event with less than 10 games the format played. I had only had really opportunity to play like one draft on Arena after spending like I've had a lot to catch up on since having COVID and being off it, and thankfully I'm finally like, I realize today is probably the first day I haven't had like a latent cough at all. So it's been just like kind of a long road of that, and then catching up on all the things you miss out on when you're sick for that long. But I went to this event and I actually played this really, I mean, first of all, even preparing for the event, like just reading a lot of the discourse around certain red-green commons that are very good in the format. But then taking that and saying, okay, let's extrapolate that into what that means is good in the format, and kind of talking with my friends who did get a chance to play and getting their ideas. But down to like playing even and identifying what was important in the games I was playing just of sealed. And specifically, I had a match against one of my friends who I drove up with. The event was about like an hour and a half away. And so we had talked on the way up. We were like, looked at each other's decks. I had won round one, he'd lost round one, and then we got paired in round two. And we're playing this really, really long game where he actually looked at my deck and I hadn't looked at his all too well. So I was trying to figure out what I was playing around when he makes this like big alpha strike with me at one life with some trampling creatures, some non-trampling creatures, and I just took the time, not like an overwhelming amount of time, but like, looked at all of my blocks, identified how it was possible that I could die, identified what creatures I needed to live, in order to like have a chance of winning on the attack back if I drew what I needed, or, what my outs were, and just taking the time in this turn where the whole match effectively, how long this game was maybe 30 minutes in progress already. We're like, we were both down to like 7 or less cards in our library, just about everything in play, saying, okay, how do I win this game, and how do I make sure I survive this combat in a position to win the game? And then really doing the work on board to do that in that kind of board state. Actually turned out my opponent had done the math wrong, had not identified that, like, did not have lethal, with me blocking around the trick that I thought he might have, or like around him having just a generic trick to get one of his trampling things through, lined up the double blocks that made things work for me while blocking everything else, and then exactly dealing lethal on the attack back. And it was just one of those moments where, like, we talk, and you Mason especially, you bang the drum of attacking and blocking being like the most important thing in Magic for most people to get down in the first place, because so many games wind up decided by it. But especially seeing like a really clogged board state like that, and coming out of it not only making a good block, but the block that lets me win and steal this game that I was pretty far behind in for quite a long time. It was just like a real validation of like, okay, we really put in the work and had to even built our deck to have the outs and make the decisions over the course of that game. And so it was one I felt really, really good about how I played, and especially just taking the time on that very complicated combat to identify how it was I could still win was a pretty big W.
I love that. I talked about my experience with Steve Rubin last week, and just us not doing exactly that, and it's cool to hear you bang the drum of the importance of like just doing the work when the game gives you the opportunity to do the work.
There's almost like this sick, weird thing I've been thinking about recently, which is like, this is a big part of Magic and a big part of playing the game, and people don't engage with it. And so it makes you wonder, like, it is definitely a fun part, but it's like such a overwhelming part sometimes. I think people just shut down. So like, good job basically like doing that. I don't know. It's tough. It's been told about you.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about Modern a little bit. I was looking at some of the decks. We were going to record Clash this weekend, but like Father's Day ended up, taking a lot of time, and so we were working on different Eldrazi decks and stuff. But I also spent some time my former co-host Matt Kling and my friend is working on getting every character into what's called Elite Smash. And he has 3 characters left. And one of them is a character called Bayonetta, just from the game Bayonetta. And, he was really struggling for a while with it. And, I really felt like the type of thing that he would enjoy. It is this combo, intricate character that relates to a lot of things that he likes to do in both Smash and in Magic, in all honesty. And so we sat down and we watched a guide together to kind of talk about it, like a everything to know about Bayonetta guide that goes over kind of the intricacies of the character. And while watching it, I was thinking about Magic, and I I thought this character is harder at a base level, like to just do the basics with this character, than any deck in Magic is to learn the basics of. And when I think about that, I was like, man, like what a cool thing for Magic. That the hard things are, like, I think everybody is still physically and mentally capable of doing them. Like, if you put in the work, you're going to be able to do them. And it's okay that they're hard. But, like, there are other games that aren't Magic where there's, like, a barrier to entry that, like, you might not even be capable of hitting. And I just think that Magic, it's hard things, we've talked a lot about on this podcast historically about, like, learning Amulet Titan and how, like, the barrier to entry is a little bit hard, but once you get there, it's like actually like pretty easy to pick up the new stuff and learn it. And, we talked about combo decks like Storm, or how hard aggressive decks are to get good with and things like that. And I don't know, it gave me kind of a respect for, like, man, the hard things in Magic are really fun. Like, once you get them, they're very rewarding. And I'm really glad that our game doesn't have something that difficult, I guess.
Yeah, that is something about Magic that I very much appreciate, and like have appreciated for a long time, is that a lot of things that are difficult are very conceptual and not execution bound. Unless there's like loops on Moto and stuff, those can be pretty tough. But yeah, that's the hard things in Magic, and what makes Magic, I think, such a great game. Just as a quick side, is that like if you can understand it, you can do it, right? If you can think it, you can do it in a lot of ways, and that's not the case for every game.
Anyway, that's it for me. I gained a new respect for hard things in Magic, and I'm probably going to complain a lot less about hard things, because I think that they're cool. No Patreon shoutouts this week, but if you want to become a patron of CCMG, head on over to patreon.com/CCMG. We appreciate all of it. It always means the world. And we got a request that we're going to talk about from a patron this weekend that I'm excited to talk about in our next podcast meeting. But I just wanted to mention this, like, if you have things that you want to see from the Patreon or from us, never hesitate to reach out. I think that the feedback that I got this week was really good. I won't mention it on the show because I don't want to spoil it in case we do it, but I just really appreciate that type of stuff. So, and then don't forget to check out our sponsors. Heavy Play. We talked a lot about them last week. I got some feedback from people that they said, I'm gonna take the plunge because of you and Mason last week, and that was really cool to hear. So if you're gonna take the plunge and try out these awesome products, don't forget to use the code CCMTG for 10% off. And then head on over to the link in the show notes for Untapped.gg. They are the #1 arena overlay deck tracker. It's, we talked last week about how maybe it's a little bit of a crutch for me, and I elected actually not to use it this week, just to like give myself a refresher. But I'm going to jump into the MH3 streets, and the draft stuff I'm probably going to need it for. I need to remember what all my cards do and stuff. But yeah, use that, and let's go into our main topic right away. It is Training Grounds this week is for Pioneer Rules of Engagement. Last week, we talked about Rules of Engagement kind of holistically. We maybe mentioned some stuff for Pioneer because it's Pioneer season. But, we want to talk about what's going on in Pioneer right now and some things that you need to think about. And kind of just a reminder, the things that we hope these things fall into are kind of, what can I do in Pioneer? What matters in Pioneer? Where can I do it? When can I do it? And, how do I execute? And kind of the rules around those things are where we want to focus. But we kind of have a list of talking points of things that we'll discuss these as kind of a bigger topic, and then kind of dive in. Mason, why don't you tell us about our first talking point?
Yeah, so there are a lot of big things that are going on in Pioneer. And I think the biggest one to me that sort of guides everything is you have to have a plan for Vein Ripper. I think from that point, everything else stems, including like respecting other decks, interaction. But Vein Ripper, and specifically Sorin doing this on turn 3, is something that is a big jumping out point from the Pro Tour, and something that totally shifts the game on its head. And if you don't have like a plan for this or respect for this, you might just automatically lose. And something that, I've gotten some, pushback against from some people is that, like, this isn't even like a top thing to do in the format if you are prepared for it. And I think a lot of that comes from people not really being ready. But I think this is the first thing that really jumps out to me when I think about Pioneer is how do I line up if my opponent goes like interact with either Thoughtseize or a Fatal Push, play somebody, and then Sorin Vein Ripper. How can I interact against those things?
When I think about Vein Ripper, I think about a card that doesn't read how it plays out very well. Like, you read it and it seems kind of nebulous, and then you play the games of Pioneer, and you're like, oh, this is actually game warping in a lot of ways. Like Mason's saying, is like a little bit format warping. The format is completely different because of this interaction entering the fray, and you see that by people playing more Sheoldred's Edict, more Liliana's. I think is it Blot Out or Plot Out? The 3-mana one.
It's Blot Out. Plot's the mechanic in the set.
Yeah, just like that card completely taking over mirror matches because one of you draws it and then the other one just loses. And I think that it doesn't just have to be, how do I answer this Vein Ripper? A lot of decks are like, okay, can I put enough pressure on that, that there is opportunity for me to play past the Vein Ripper, but really having a plan for when things go south and they do that is really important.
Yeah, and we've seen decks like Rakdos Midrange just exit the format around a similar time that the Vein Ripper stuff popped up, because Vein Ripper stuff is so strong, especially in those matchups, and like kind of wins the head-to-head, the one-on-one. And we've seen that, Rakdos Mid has done okay from time to time since then, but for the most part has fallen off because this is just such a bigger and better thing doing a lot of similar stuff, and they can't really answer this without playing a ton of cards like Blot Out, which can be hard to do if you don't have that sort of, Vein Ripper of your own pressure compared to the rest of the format. So
I think that also it's important to note that like so many of the decks in the format like really conform to this rule in terms of like if your plan, I mean, like you were saying, Spencer, people are playing more Lilianas, more Sheoldred's Edicts, they're playing Blot Outs, right? This card demands, because of the ward cost of it, sacrificing creature, either demands that you're playing a deck where you're able to afford to sacrifice a creature to it to get it off the table, along with some other efficient answer, or you're playing sideboard cards which answer it without having to pay the ward cost, right? Or you're playing just these answers in your main deck sometimes too, or skewing towards being able to clean up a Vein Ripper without it getting any collateral. And if your deck can't do that effectively, it's a non-starter almost for you to not be building your deck in a way that has a plan for this card, because it is, to your point, Mason, it is the apex predator of threats in the format. It's able to be supported by a really, really strong interaction package. And even just as like an end game, even if you never do the Sorin thing in a game, if you're just casting a Vein Ripper on as the game goes on, that alone can be enough, especially in a game that's been a slog like that, to completely change the dynamic or completely be impossible for a lot of people to answer from help.
Yeah, and we see decks like Niv, right, like as one of the premium control decks pop up because of this, because they can play Caryatid, which gives it an early creature to sort of sacrifice to the Vein Ripper trigger, right, like get it to the spot where it wants to be. And we've seen decks like Blue White fall off because they don't handle it well, right? Like moving up to 5 mana for Sunfall for them is too late. It's too hard. And Caryatid, in combination with being able to block some of these aggressive decks we'll talk about later, some of the decks Spencer likes to play, like getting those early blocks and this effect in while bridging you to your bigger spells sooner, really sort of made this kind of the de facto control deck of the format. And, kind of like we were saying there, Avery, you have to like build it in mind. You also have to pick your decks in mind with these kind of things, right? So
I think that, the plan thing, I was thinking about how kind of Blue-White Spirits has made kind of this like resurgence in the format a little bit. And I honestly think that a lot of the reason for that is that it's a deck that like doesn't really mind getting thought seized that much, that has ample opportunities to answer things like this while continuing to like apply its own game plan. And like, while I'm not like saying, oh, like go play Blue-White Spirits, like it's, you know, at the top of its metagame, I do think that's where it gained its metagame share. And I think that's kind of not something I had thought about before this conversation.
Yeah, I think that between, like, it's a very good point to point out, like, between the uptick in, like, I mean, the Rakdos deck got worse against Spell Pierce by adding, like, Sorin, so all the soft counter magic got a bit better at being non-creature stuff, or it has more expensive threats that are easy to tag. And it's just also, like, that all came at the cost of, like, Bone Crusher Giant, its worst nightmare. You know, an efficient answer that then clocked you if you, like, didn't do something worth interacting with. Like, okay, I'll just play out this thing that's big enough to attack you every turn, and that becomes a problem. So, yeah, I think Bane Ripper and Vampires are definitely, like, part of the rules engagement of the format for those reasons. You know, they really do define, like, what you can do from a structural level in terms of, like, your game plan, and start to define, like, you know, how fast, like, the speed of the format in part is defined by, like, this being a good enough thing or something you need to be able to interact with.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that specifically, and I think that the next kind of talking point we should talk about is, like, kind of the early turns and being able to interact with either the board or with the stack, or, you know, however you're going to do it within those first 3 turns is pretty key. You know, when during coaching, the Pioneer came up a lot for me, and we would talk about things like we would look at one of the things that I would do is we'd look at the Pioneer decks. This is back when Mono Green was still a thing, but it was like, okay, look at all these 1-mana spells that Phoenix is playing. Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, and Rakdos. You know, 8 elves in Mono Green as, like, you know, kind of these things. And I don't think that, like, that has changed with with Vampires entering, because it's still that same Fatal Push Thoughtseize deck, but now it has those explosive turn replays too. So you really have to, and now, I mean, aggro's finally back on the menu, right? Between Mono Red and Gruul, you know, Gigantodecks are prevalent. Honestly, like, I when I was playing the deck in Vegas, the number of times where I, like, revealed Giganta and my opponent went, oh crap, I'm in trouble, was, like, a lot, which means that maybe they are ignoring this rule, or they, you know, aren't prepped for it.
Yeah, I think a subset of that too is, like, Amalia, which is a deck we didn't talk about as much in our last Pioneer outing, so I'll make sure to bring it up now for the Amalia lovers. But, you know, that's a deck where, like, you know, they can kill you on turn 3 if you do not have some way to interact, right? Like, Soul Warden effect, into Amalia, into Wildgrowth Walker, you are dead, you know? And that is, it doesn't matter if you have blockers, those don't count, you know? You have to have some way to interact. And while you can interact with any of those pieces and you will stop them from getting you, you do have to have something. And that is another point where a lot of pressure came a little bit before the Bane Ripper was printed. That was kind of the point where things started to choke. And we actually saw the format react in very interesting ways at that time, right? Where it was like, oh, this new pressure means cards like Shieldred are going down in value, right? And cards like Inti went up a little because they let you push through the Amalia. They were cheaper. They kind of gave you a ability to win the game. We saw that happen then. Obviously, like we talked about before, Rakdos midrange has sort of fallen off, but it just shows, like, a real world example of how important these things can be. And, you know, the Bane Ripper deck does, a decent enough job of stopping this with, you know, being the Thoughtseize Fatal Push deck.
I've been playing Modern on Moto. Has Blue-Eye been fixed yet? It hasn't, right?
I think they fixed that a couple days ago.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Yeah, I think it was just like a little 3 or 4 day period that it was kind of messed up.
What's interesting to me is, like, if it is fixed, Amalia did pretty good right now too. Like, I think it had 2 of the 3 challenges that I looked at. Like, it put up strong results, and I think that has to do with there being a lot of good decks in Pioneer right now, and thus this rule of, like, the beginning of the turns becomes more important because there's a wider net of things that you have to care about. So some of those catch-all answers, like Thoughtseize or Fatal Push, like, they become a lot better, you know, as you need to deal with more things. So
Yeah, and I think also, like, to Amalia's credit, and it's kind of when we talk about rules of engagement. I think the first time it ever came up on the show, I think you said it really well in terms of it was like someone you'd been working with in coaching, Spencer, where it was defining decks that you could or couldn't play, or where it was we were choosing to lean into or out of the rules of engagement of the format. Where you're putting your points for San Diego. That I think right now in the format, when you talk between kind of the more reactive decks that are playing on inevitability, like Bring the Light, or decks that are trying to go under that with the Gruul decks, or even just decks like Green, which are trying to skip out on this rule in particular. When those things happen, right, and those decks start to win, decks like Amalia, decks like Slickshot Prowess, those all gain a lot of ground, as decks like Blue White lose ground for maybe not playing by those rules well enough. And so I bring that up to say that there's a lot of ways to think about, right, having the rules we're going to talk about, defining those and having those in mind. Like, there's a lot of ways to think about that can tell you a bit about where the metagame's going or been based on those results. But it's not surprising to me that over the last month, as we've seen decks way more focused on kind of either going around the problem of getting Vein Rippered by just going over it in terms of power, or going around things that Phoenix does really well by saying, okay, I'm just going to punish you by doing things that are much stronger and more resilient to that, and punish the way your deck's constructed, like Green. Those are decks that are going to continue to start to apply that pressure and pull that away, and allow opportunities for decks like this to gain more prey for predators like Amalia, to just be like, okay, I'm gonna clean the clock of anyone who doesn't show up ready to respect and have removal. Or even sometimes Rakdos has the problem of I don't have enough removal, right? Having to build your deck to respect the amount of these things, and then tuning with those in mind definitely becomes a real challenge. That can change based on how many people are or are not respecting these rules of engagement, because the decks that you could play against really define how important those are.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because we talk a lot when we talk about this type of stuff. We often are like, even I think all of us have probably talked to somebody about this concept. And it's like, okay, are there times where it's okay to ignore something like this, right? Like, where what you're doing is inherently different enough or broken enough, or you're going around it. And I think about Quintorius combo of it's I'm presenting I'm playing a little bit of a different game, or Hidden Strings. I'm going to play a little bit of a different game. So it's interesting. Something you mentioned during your last point, Abe, was kind of talking about Phoenix and its position with both soft counters and its position with its ability to interact early. And one of the things that I think that we should highlight in that is Treasure Cruise's place in the format, and its pressure it puts on an individual game when you're playing against Phoenix and have to play against that Treasure Cruise, because it means that you're going to either try to make it not matter by playing something that doesn't care if they draw 3 cards, or you're going to say you're going to die before you're going to be effectively dead before that Treasure Cruise goes off.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is my number one rule to make sure I'm following in terms of when it comes to building out my game plans for my deck, is to know that the format is really warped around the existence of Treasure Cruise in way more ways than people think. When we talk about decks that are trying to just end the game really early, a big strength of theirs is that they know they're playing against Treasure Cruise to say, you're not going to get to 7 or 8 cards in your graveyard and cast a Treasure Cruise and use the 3 cards you draw before I've enacted my game plan. That's a very valid way to try to approach the problem of Treasure Cruise. Or to say that you can draw 3 to 6 extra cards in the course of this game by resolving a cruise or 2. I will draw 12, right? Things like Up the Beanstalk, or even just Niv Mizzet itself, make a very compelling argument for saying I can hang in terms of card generation with a deck that gets to do it for the most efficient way possible by finding its efficiency elsewhere. And so, in every deck that I'm playing, when it comes to like, what matters and how am I doing things, it's like, how when I'm looking at the game, like, am I planning to win by making it so my opponent never gets to the point where they're able to reap the benefits of having all this card advantage? Or am I trying to just win in the stage of the game where we're at abundance, right? Like, thinking about the famous, like, Sam Black, big game, small game. It's like, am I trying to keep the game small enough or win the game in a portion where it's small enough that maybe they resolve one treasure cruise, and I'm hoping that they don't have time to resolve that treasure cruise and then cast Opt Considers and Sleight of Hands to find their next Lightning Axe or, their Temporal Trespass to actually, like, close the game on me? Or am I willing to let them do all that stuff and say, I'll find my Go Blank, or I'll Sunfall their birds away and shut off what it is they have going, and I don't really care that they're going to have that many cards in hand because I'm also going to be hanging on in terms of resources. And like, both are ways to approach the problem, but if you're not acknowledging that that's a way that the games are going to go, or having a plan around either, if you're a deck that keeps the game small, saying, okay, I need to find ways to disrupt my opponent from treasure cruising in the first place when it comes to like how I'm sideboarding. Right, cards like Unlicensed Hearse really fit well into this mold of, okay, I'm trying to end the game before my opponent gets to do all their stuff, and especially with most Phoenix plans being like Crackling Drake post sideboard, it's like, okay, I need to keep the game from getting to a point where they can reliably do that and protect that. So I need to be both attacking their graveyards so they can't get ahead of me on cards, and also, attacking their life total so that I can not give them the time. Or finding an approach of saying, I'll cast Rest in Peace and I'll go down a card early, but then it's going to cut off this avenue forever, or whenever I draw it, it's going to cut off this avenue for the rest of the game, and, I'll be able to fight through whatever else it is they do. Or like, maybe I'll just try to just throw counter magic at the problem. Like, I'll try to counter the treasure cruises, but I'm willing to fight over other things too. These are all approaches you can take, but I think if you're not finding an approach for the treasure cruise problem, or the things it creates in terms of what decks become viable around it, you're not playing the same Pioneer as everyone else, in my mind.
Yeah, I think it's funny, I had just mentioned Quintorius Combo is like a deck that's kind of like ignoring some of these rules, and kind of just looking over the matchup spread for Phoenix. It's one of the ones it's ignoring. It's like, okay, you can draw as many cards as you want, but like, you actually stop me, and that's all it's asking. And I think that has also been historically true of Lotus Field, which did historically have a good Phoenix matchup, but it looks like it's tightened up, and Phoenix is caring about that right now. And it's one of those that we mentioned, like, is this a rule that I need to engage with, or is this a rule that I need to ignore?
Yeah, I think it's something too where it's like, it's even less that they're caring about it and more pick, lock, Brinkster change the deck, right? Like, the fact that you're not tapping out on 3, and you get to hold up your mana so that the cards you are sideboarding in against them are better, and it's cheaper to find them, and it's cheaper to fuel your treasure cruise. This combination with like Prophetic Memory really helped that matchup a lot, and that's something I know where a lot of Phoenix players who were very against the matchup are like, yeah, I think it's like getting back to a point where I'm pretty like okay with that due to these like changes, and understanding like what matters in your deck and why you're losing these games is so important, which is the core of like why we're doing this training grounds. And I think Abe nailed it on Treasure Cruise. I don't really have anything to add in regards of like how much Treasure Cruise works the format, but I think it's really interesting to see how some of the decks try to fight it. Abe mentioned Gruul, for example. He's like, oh, you're going to do it, you're going to kill him, you're not going to use his cards. Well, some of the control decks are trying to fight this in various ways as well, right? Like, we look at Up the Beanstalk, or the Waste Not decks, or the No More Lies decks. These are kind of like the 3 main control decks, and there's 3 sort of thing on 2 they're trying to do. And specifically with Niftalite, their hope is to drown people in cards, and Beanstalk is a card that theoretically can out advantage something like Treasure Cruise given the time. And you just have to be able to stop those Phoenixes, right? And stop the pressure from hitting you long enough to actually deploy your cards. But it's interesting to see sort of how these decks are running people out of cards in very different ways, right? Up the Beanstalk is sort of doing that theory Abe talked a long time ago about with Yorion, right? Which was just like answer density, kind of the inverse of threat density. If my deck plays 25 kill spells or whatever, and your deck has 20 threats that matter, well, if I can get to them all, I will win the game or whatever. And it uses up the beanstalk to facilitate that. And we see Waste Not, as a way of basically saying, like, hey, if you can clear the board with Shieldred in play, it is very strong. And one of the best ways to do that is to just have a bunch of kill spells or cards like Go Blank. And then Waste Not, helps answer with some of these things, like tie the room together. And then we see No More Lies kind of being like the most traditional version of just like, hey, you interact a little bit, 1-for-1, play a Wrath, play a card advantage spell, win the game, right? And that one has been on a little bit of a downtick, in part because there was the bug for a little bit of time, but also just in general, we've been seeing players move towards these other two, because this is one that can struggle with some of the other players in the format, specifically Vayne Ripper, which we talked about at the top of the show. So it's just really interesting to see like the different ways people are going about respecting these rules and how they want to interact with them. And we're seeing success from, all these decks, right? Like Niflheight's done quite well. Waste Not, in spite everything that makes sense, is continue to do quite well. And, this is just something that's very interesting about the format.
I want to dive deeper into something you said at the top of the show, but it's about these same decks. And that's kind of about, we've now established like this pressure that Treasure Cruise puts on the format. And one of the things that I think some of these control decks do to take advantage of that, right, is they get to play Wrath effects that impact people playing towards beating out, card advantage, right? And there are lots of decks that in this format struggle with Wrath effects, and there are a lot of Wrath effects in Pioneer between Supreme Verdict, Farewell, Anger of the Gods. There's a ton. And, decks will play them like, turns 3 through 5, but like, really, really make you work around what's available to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying is really true. And I think that Bring the Light, like the Niflheight decks, are one of the biggest culprits of it, because its Wraths are so good against Vayne Ripper specifically. And I think that, like, when you think about what that means for the format, right, knowing that the Premier Fair decks, right, they're built around either being Supreme Verdict decks or being Bring the Light for Sunfall decks, or, if you're a deck that even has, is one that pressures your opponent to put down a Wrath, like the 3-mana Wraths of like Temporary Lockdown or Anger of the Gods are well in play, or even, and even being able to respect that. I think that does add a big dynamic to the format of how those decks need to build themselves as well, right? Like, if you knew that you were going to play against, or if you know you're going to play against Anger of the Gods in, 20% of your rounds, and, other Wraths in the other 30%, it's like, okay, half the rounds when we're playing against Wraths, I need to know when it is I'm going to be Wrathed, how I'm going to be Wrathed, and how I'm going to rebuild from that. And, to your point, Spencer, right now, especially in your game ones, you're building your deck for game one, like, you should have a really good plan for turn 5 to be your rebuild turn, right? Like, your Niv opponent's probably going to go, Caryatid into Wrath. Your blue-eyed opponent's probably going to cast Verdict on 4, or do enough to disrupt you that Verdict on 4 is what you need to be ready for, and being able to rebuild after that is something you absolutely need to be prepared for, because that turn 4 is a really pivotal turn for the reactive decks, and knowing that coming into it means that that's why cards like Collected Company do so well, and also why I've been seeing in the Amalia decks, I think Lively Dirge has been coming up in popularity, because it just sets you up perfectly to either be a 4-mana play if you got Wrath and you're the player on the draw, or be a 5-mana play to follow up getting a 5-mana Wrath when you're on the play, right? You can just set up to immediately combo, even if you do get your combo exiled. You can find the piece of it you need and get it all in play. And that's all, like, if you don't, that's definitely rule engagement, right? If you don't consider that, you're not going to build your deck in a way that's going to be able to win in the way you're going to interact with.
It's a bit of a balancing act against the Niflheight decks too. I know in Vegas, the decks that were doing well were the 5-color decks, at least like at the beginning of the day. I didn't really check to see at the end of the day, but like, they were these decks that played Ancient Cornucopia over Sylvan Caryatid, and like, that still has the same turn, right? Like, it's still you go Ancient Cornucopia, and then you can either nib to light for that Sunfall, or you're doing it for nib, and they're gaining 7 life. It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, the Ancient Cornucopia thing I was actually going to bring up, so I'm really glad you did, Spencer, where this is actually, I think, becoming a new rule in engagement, where we're seeing players experiment with, like, trimming down some other stuff just to play 4 of this, which, in combination with Caryatids. Some players are turning Caryatids into this, but, the jury's still kind of out right now. But, like, just having a bunch of, like, this a turn sooner is so good, and that life gain is so important. I recently played this deck at a RCQ, and I was so impressed with, like, just having the ability to be like, okay, play this Ancient Cornucopia, on, like, turn 4 even, cast this spell, kill your thing, gain some life, and then on the following turns be like, kind of big, impactful play, gain some life on your turn, Lightning Helix your thing, gain 2, gain 3, that kind of huge swing, I think, is a real part of Pioneer now, and, like, especially as it seems like more and more of these players are wanting to play this card. So, yeah, Ancient Cornucopia has been really impressive. I think it's becoming a rule of, like, can you actually close games out against them?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a paper, Bring to Light, Mirror Mason. I think I was telling you about this because I was watching one in RCQ like a month ago, and I realized if you're someone if you're going to draw the Valky sub game and wind up in the spot of like, oh god, how do I win? 1 Mirrex, baby, because everyone will be at like a virtual 200 life total pool by the end of the game. Like, everyone gains so much life because Cornucopia is just so good at that. And especially, like you were saying, Mason, being able to cast it and start casting spells in the same turn to get the immediate kickback of, like, maybe my turn 5 or my turn 4 even isn't, I'm going to just cast a spell, or like I'm going to pay a tap land and play my removal spell. It could be I'm going to play my Cornucopia, play my Lightning Helix, gain 5 life, and suddenly that's going to undo a lot of what you did in the early game, and create a real stressor on decks trying to end the game. And it means that also, no matter what kind of deck you are, if you're not a combo deck, or you're not a control deck winning via like attrition and really running the amount of resources, you had better have a plan for making sure you are ending the game before they get to start doing that. Because 2 or 3 turns the Cornucopia in play, if you're just, burn or whatever, or like, some like a mono white humans deck, that's going to be a problem if you're allowing them to get to that stage of the game. And it's not that difficult for them to thrive in it if they're able to draw that right amount of answers. Every Helix being double Lightning Helix and every other removal spell being Lightning Helix is a real problem to get your head around, and not having a recursive source of ways to do things and put pressure on the game from that stage onward, like even for your aggressive decks, knowing what your plan is in the same way as I was just saying for Rats, knowing what that plan is in the same way for just the games that will drag on, being able to win some number of those games when your opponent is hanging in there. I think of Jegantha in the red decks is a perfect example of this, where even though we've had some conversations on like, is this card even worth it? Because like, how often does it really get cast? I think it's getting more and more relevant to be able to do something like play something that requires a full answer on its own and can carry some weight, even if it's just you get 5 points of damage for your 8 mana and 1 more card out of your opponent's hand. Things like that, you really need to be... You can't forego those under a lot of circumstances now, because all of the reactive decks have a lot of staying power.
It really matters too, even if you're like, because Spencer, you mentioned the Contorius deck a lot this episode. It's a deck I've actually been trying out some recently as well, and like understanding how much life and how much like space your opponent can create to like have a buffer super matters. And like, this is the thing I think happens a lot where, and we've all probably heard this and done this, where it's like, oh, now that I've played against this deck, or now that I know what they're doing, I'm not going to lose again. Or like, I won't lose in this way again, right? And the Quintorius deck is one where I think people think it just does a million damage game ends. But like, it, especially some of the more recent builds, only playing 6 clone effects, there are like variations and hits where like, you actually just do not kill if the Cornucopia comes down and they're interacting, especially if they're interacting with your Quintoriuses, right? So you start to discover, and they're like, all right, I'm going to kill your Quintorius. Like, all right, well, I'll put my clone in my hand then. And gaining that extra 7-8 life literally can be turn a bad matchup into a game-winning matchup, because now it's like, yeah, I didn't have an answer spell for your last Quintorius, but it also only drained me for like 14. So I just have to beat your 6/6s now, go, which is something that deck can easily do. So it's really important to understand what all the decks are capable of doing and understanding like they are able to like gain life and create space in those ways. And Spencer, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about like kind of the buffer that you just mentioning is, I was talking to a player during the SCG about he was not playing Giganta and he was playing Mono Red, and it's because he's playing Chandra Dress to Kill, which is I think something that Abe and I actually discussed both on the podcast and off the podcast quite a bit of like, which of these do I really want and why do I want them? Because like that is kind of the tug and pull. And, I think that there's a real argument for like something like Chandra Dress to Kill in a world of Niv, whereas in a world of Rakdos, there's a lot more of an argument for Giganta, where it's like, I want just this thing that has to be answered, and they've probably used a lot of their resources already. And it's kind of about like what the resources are that you're trying to tax, right? A Chandra after a Wrath effect, for example, is probably just as effective as a Giganta after a Wrath effect. So that was just something that I thought about when Abe was talking about Lightning Helix. Abe, you were talking kind of about having stuff to do when the natural progression of basically the format ends, right? Like, we talked a lot about decks needing to execute their game plan, and but what happens when you both execute or you both disrupt, and now you're in this limbo? Can you just talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just important to, even in your decks that are like somewhat proactive or aren't really designed for the late game, to have plans for how to exist in games that are beyond your reach. If your only plays you're going to be able to make, and this is why things like, boss Sly style, like mono red decks don't typically do too well in Pioneer, is because you need to really be able to get a lot of mileage out of your cards, because the games will go longer than, I'm going to cast Shock at your face like 3 or 4 times. Like that's not a cohesive plan that's going to be able to win. And that's why cards like, even Slick Shot does so well, is that it turns those spells into so much more than they are. It lets you get a lot more mileage out of the ones you have by being effectively 2 prowess bodies on one card, in the one, and that's what even makes it competitive at this stage, is that threat can be that potent in those spots to be that much faster. But even beyond that, thinking about like I was saying about Amalia, like making sure you have ways to set up and get the most out of what you have on that turn after you've been completely shut down, right? Being able to rebuild after a Wrath turn or whatever the game ending thing that some of the reactive decks are doing in the format, that's really important. And that extends beyond just decks like Amalia or decks like Mono Red. That extends to, decks like Convoke, like Spirits, like even Rakdos has this too, where you can't just be like, oh, I've used all my cards in my hand, this is where we're at, I hope I draw something. Like, if that's the way you're trying to play the game, and I think that's another pressure that like Phoenix also is really guilty of putting on the format, of like, if you're not constantly taking game action, you're almost guaranteed to get outdrawn. So that's where things like Hive the Eye Tyrant out of Rakdos, or like having a bunch of Mutavaults out of Rakdos, and it really starts coming to play. Or just having these plan Bs and cards in your deck that really give you outlets to continue to impact the game meaningfully and put the pressure on your opponent and keep it on, so they need to find the answers. Because if you don't do that, I think that's just, it makes it so you're not even really able to beat half the decks in the format that are doing that.
I'm really glad that you mentioned Amalia, because I think this is the best deck in the format at literally doing this, where it's like every draw step is like exactly, like, it doesn't matter what term of the game it is for Amalia. Like, they could draw something that just ends the game right now, between Lively Dirge, Return of the Ring, Sword of the Calling, like Court of Calling, like all of it. It's just like, all right, well, they've got like 15 draws in their deck that just end the game, so I need to both be putting on pressure so that they don't do that, and then also interacting with them so that they don't do that. And it doesn't matter if it's turn 8 or turn whatever, because they gain so much life. They have, all of their stuff is like little dicky stuff, so it's like, I don't know. I just think it's very good at doing this. I'm thinking about Lotus for a second, and Lotus is literally, if you don't kill me by turn 5, you die. Like, that's basically the name of the game. And I'm curious, on your guys' perspective, Mason, I'll start with you. How do you decide when to care about Lotus and what Lotus is doing?
Yeah, I think Lotus is a good stand-in for, like, the elephant in the room that we keep talking about, Quintorius and things like that. I recently played against the Colossification deck in the tournament. Just having, like, the ability to kill you if uninterrupted and sort of assemble, their thing. And I think it's something that I think about a lot when my deck kind of has the tools outside of just obviously, like, if it's a big player in the metagame, I think about it. But, like, abstractly right now, Lotus Field isn't seeing a ton of play, right? It's seeing a fair amount, so is Quintorius, but it's not like it was at certain points during Pioneer where it was like the second or third most played deck, at worst at any given point. And I think that for me, a big thing of it is, like, one, how does my deck line up against it in the first place, right? Am I good against it? Well, if I'm really good against it, I, probably don't want anything that directly is targeting it. Maybe something like a Spell Pierce could be my plan for something like this, right? Just pierce an early scrying, pierce, a hidden strings. Versus, like, if my deck's also really bad against it, well, maybe I want to have a card that does something in other spots that overlaps here. That's actually helping a matchup that I think I could swing. If I have an 80-20 matchup, Spencer, I don't want to throw 4 sideboard cards to make my matchup 70-30, probably, right? Now, if I can get it to help other matchups, then, coolio. So that's where a lot of it goes to me, is kind of like, how's my deck doing? How does it interact? And, like, if it's something that's really close, I might just want to, like, actually play some cards. And Damping Sphere is, like, the de facto card people go to. But I think there are lots of cards that are frustrating for that deck to play against, Like, I talked about Spell Pierce, if you have good pressure, having Graveyard Interaction comes up a lot. Nightmare Render is, like, a really nice card, just stopping some of their key cards and overlaps with decks like Amalia. So there are lots of things you can do. And, I think it's just a matter of, like, how do I line up versus these things? And also, how prevalent are they? Like, and typically the way things work with Lotus Field is, like, the less we talk about them, they eventually hit a critical point where people cut enough cards they forget, and then it spikes and does really well on the weekend. And then everyone kind of overreacts. And we're all like, okay, we're going to get our Ashioks, our Damping, or whatever. And then you're just not going to win any games. And then, like, it resets over time.
It's like the living at infinity rule.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting to see sort of, like, okay, what's going to happen with these cards as time moves on.
There's a big elephant in the room that's not Quintorius, and it's Thoughtseize. And I think we should talk about it before we wrap up. There's a lot of Thoughtseize decks. There's Rakdos Mid, there's Rakdos Vamps, there's Mono Black. Even out of the sideboard of some decks, like, I think that I saw multiple, I'm looking at Pioneer this last week, I saw multiple Niv decks playing Thoughtseize out of the board. Like, Thoughtseize is a huge part of the format, to the point where, like, people are playing main deck Duress in this format a lot. And so mulliganing with Thoughtseize in mind is pretty important in this format. And we talked about this a while ago when I was talking about some of the worst matchups for Gruul with Abe, about how, like, I really felt like Mono Black was a tough matchup, not because, like, you don't have the tools to beat it, but because you're, like, a resource, you need a lot of resources, but you also, like, just can't just keep a hand that's going to lose Thoughtseize, and so it makes that matchup really tough. And I think that the pressure that Thoughtseize puts on this pre-game decision has been the basis of Pioneer since Pioneer seasons started. So since the we came back from lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the number one thing that I think binds together a lot of the decks in Pioneer is redundancy, right? The ability to operate without one of your most important pieces, or having virtually, like 10 to 12 copies of the cards that are important, if they're really that important, is an absolute must in Pioneer. And I think that Thoughtseize has so much to do with that, to your point, Spencer. Like, you cannot be, when you're playing Pioneer, you can't be keeping hands in the dark that require you to just have this card in your hand, or else you're doomed. Because, I mean, Waste Not plays Thoughtseize, Vampires plays Thoughtseize. Heck, there are even just some random, like, rogue decks out there that'll play some Thoughtseizes. I would not expect to just play a match of Pioneer or even play a whole Pioneer tournament and not get Thoughtseized like in one, let alone two of my rounds. The card is just one of those pillars of the format that needs to be respected, and that really lends itself to like what decks are good. And like I said, like critical mass decks that require you to be having a lot of the same pieces or really homogenous payoffs, those are really what thrive in Pioneer because of that. And even think about Lotus, right? Like the most important cards in Lotus don't get Thoughtseized. Every deck, I think, and this is probably the oldest standing rule. I don't know if you guys agree with this, but the oldest standing rule in Pioneer is that the decks that people play naturally are already built to respect it a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean you can just ignore the fact that it exists when you're playing. Like you may have already won the battle against Thoughtseize by not registering like, you know, a 4-card Splinter Twin that requires all of your things to, like, each of your individual pieces to be right there in your hand when you need them, but still playing with that in mind is incredibly important, and keeping hands, or, you know, having hands available to you in your deck that just can operate without the most important card in them. It's an absolute must.
There's a joke there about whether you were talking about rogue decks or rogue decks. Not sure what the joke is, but both play Thoughtseize.
Rogue decks?
No, like a rogue deck that plays rogues.
Yeah, like the rogue.
Yeah,
the rogue deck with the rogue.
Yeah, exactly.
Kindred cards.
We're going deep on this joke. I will say the Thoughtseize deck that I played against most recently that surprised me is like the crime deck, the like green black crimes with the 3-drop. Well, it actually had both 3-drops, like the green one and the black one. So yeah, there's a lot of Thoughtseizes.
Yeah, Thoughtseize is just probably the strongest card on the rate by itself in the format. Like, it is, you know, a card that probably realistically could have had a discussion early on about, like, and probably they did internally, like, is this too much for the format? Like, how much is this worth thing? Because it really does put a lot of pressure. And, you know, to sort of, like, hit home something that Abe talked about a bit there that I really think is true. And we've talked a lot about, like, a year and maybe a year and a half ago, is that, like, a lot of the best Pioneer decks were, like, 3 cards off of being a bad Modern deck. And, like, being a bad Modern deck is, like, the best Pioneer deck by so much. And we're kind of, as the format gets more cards, you know, like, these decks are leveling up, and that's becoming more and more true. And I think one of the interesting things is what we've seen is that, like, the Rakdos colors have also been fine, but also losing some of its dominance, you know? Like, a year and a half ago as well, around this time, we saw Rakdos be one of the most played decks. You know, it was just widely accepted for that kind of thing. And both actually having more variations too, right? Like, there are other reasons Rakdos Sacrifice doesn't exist in the format, but, like, it was a big role player. And as these decks have gotten stronger and more cohesive, Thoughtseize has, you know, leveled out. It's not that Thoughtseize is worse, it's that everyone else is catching up to where it is. So it's really interesting to see how that impacts everything.
Yeah, I think that we've really highlighted the things to think about just overall in Pioneer. And, you know, we've got, I think, a month and change left of RCQs. I know, you know, I looked at, you know, my schedule just today and the things available to me. And I hope that, you know, going into these events, you take the opportunity to think about this as you're picking your deck, as you're mulliganing, you know, as you have play patterns on some of those key turns that we talked about. I really hope that this episode kind of helps people out with that. Let's move on directly into our Patreon question. If you become a patron of $5 or more, you get access to the Discord, the Patreon Discord, where you can ask a question like Big Dax, who asks, which macro archetype, control, aggro, midrange, contains the best fair decks? Are we saying that ramp doesn't count in this? Saying prison doesn't count in this, Abe?
Well, prison's not a fair deck.
But inherently unfair.
Yeah. I'm personally going to say the definition of best here is not something I'm going to discuss at all.
Okay.
Because I think that makes the question way less fun to answer. And I'm going to say that aggro decks do. Aggro decks contain the best fair decks.
Okay.
Yeah, aggro decks typically just abuse the mana system the best without actually cheating anything. They're just all 1s and 2s. Really, the question should be, which of these contain the most agency decks?
Wow.
And that is a really interesting question.
Wow, Mason. I think that it like typically depends on format, but if you think about this, like from like a really big picture perspective, where you really have to go is vintage. What is the best fair deck in vintage? And the answer to that is Sultai midrange. Thus, midrange wins out.
I'm not going to get into the vintage part of the argument there, because I don't think anything about vintage is inherently fair at all.
Well, like Lurrus Saga is technically like, a mid-range deck, but like, yeah, I wouldn't say like Lurrus decks are fair. So thus we must move on to Sultai midrange.
Uh-huh.
But they're both mid-range decks,
I just don't think any of those decks are fair inherently at all. I think, honestly, the question is kind of loaded. I think fair decks, to most people, just winds up containing like 80% mid-range and then 10% on the outskirts of the other decks. That might just be me. Regardless, I will leave the wisdom of one Brad Nelson, something that I heard him say to Dylan Donegan while I was on Lotus Box, which was, he was talking to Dylan, and he was like, Dylan, just think of the last, and it was like during Teamer Energy, think of the last, 4 broken decks in Standard. What were they? And Dylan thought for a second, he was like, they were all mid-range decks. So,
here's another question from the aggro consortium would like to bring up that, is it really fair if your deck switches plans? If you're mid-range, sometimes you're grinding and sometimes you're beat downing. Is that actually fair? Or are you not lying to your opponent?
Mason, I think this is interesting. Like, maybe it's just coming boomer. Like, when I think mid-range, I literally think like Putrid Leech, Sprouting Thoranax, Bloodbraid Elf. And the question to me is like, is that deck really that mid-range? Is it like, super aggressive?
No, that deck's very mid-rangey. You got Bituminous Blast. And Bituminous Blast just turns whatever thing you're cascading into Shriekmaw. And Shriekmaw's mid-range, baby. That's an overcosted 2-for-1 right there.
You can join the conversation by heading on to Patreon, joining the Patreon Discord. Leave a YouTube comment. We love getting those YouTube comments. They really do help us out in the algorithm. Same thing with TikTok. We had a Mason TikTok do pretty well this week, and we want to see that on TikTok, on Twitter. Just that interaction really does help. So sub, review, like, all those things really help out the show. Abe, since you were on last week, where can people find you?
You can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. My DMs are still open for coaching. I have still just about time for one more person, probably booking for middle of next month. That would be mid-July. So feel free to reach out to me about that. Mason, where can I find you?
I'm on twitter.com at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can find me each and every other week over on TCG Player, writing about something. If you go to TCG Player Infinite, it is in the free section. You don't need to have a subscription to see it. Spencer, what about you?
Find me at He's a Game on Twitter. You can find me on the Need to Nerd podcast, where we talk about things like Mason being a high tower and that makes him a scumbag. And yeah, and then you can find me learning stuff on the show every week here. Abe, what did you learn this week?
I thought that coming into this, I didn't really respect enough how much Vein Ripper is something that's changing the context of the format as much as I was giving it credit for. And I think really just hearing like Mason talk about how much he really identified it as one of the number one things pushing the format. Like, I attribute a lot of things in the format more so to like Treasure Cruise than anything else, but it's definitely, especially in the micro and the small scale, like contributing that a lot of the removal is switching around to cover Vein Ripper. And just how many decks, and think about like what are the decks people can play. It's like decks that don't deal with that card effectively just are off the menu. So that was a big learning for me this week.
Mason, you sticking with Bit Blast?
Yep.
I learned off the show because it's going to get edited out, but I learned that the cornucopia is only once per turn, or whatever it's called.
Once per turn is for the colors you cast.
It's for the colors of the spell you cast.
I know that
once a turn. when you decide that what you want it to be that once a turn. It's just a weird way for a card to work. That it's like, all right, now, no, all right, now, no, all right, now, okay.
Like way too much life if you could do it more than once per turn.
I think it's just be the first time you cast a spell each turn. Then that also just like puts less burden on you.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like track,
or like the first time you cast a spell using mana from it in a turn would be nice too. Instead of just like, I'll leave this thing up to cast my other spell and gain life off that. Like,
yeah, you could also make it where it's like whenever this helps you cast a spell, gain life equal to the spell's mana value, and then that creates maybe some cool Ancient Cornucopia cards that you untap to then use it again. Where it's like, oh, maybe I'll play this card, my Kiora's Follower or whatever. So.
Minus my Kiora on my Cornucopia. Yo, Cornucopia Mono Green Mason.
Speaking of Mono Green, Elesh Norn is so good in that deck. It is insane.
I was surprised we didn't talk about Mono Green on the show this week. Just like, and it's kind of its comeback with Trailblazer and like its ability to kind of circumvent a lot of the rules. But
yeah, I think to me, we talked a little bit about in the macro with the early stuff, and then also just like it's kind of early in its life, and like I am sure Green will stick around some amount, but I'm always really hesitant when things like shoot up really quick. Like players are quick to overreact.
Absolutely.
And so.
I think Green got some. I'm gonna say it right here for the real ones at the end of the show. I think Green got some real blue-white problems, and I think Green got some real Amalia problems.
Continuation of my always in Green moment. I couldn't figure out how to sideboard with the deck at first. I was having issues, and it occurred to me that every matchup where there's a sideboard card, I don't want my ley lines. So I just started setting out the ley lines, and then in whatever 4 cards made the most sense. And I was like, I have solved, like, how do I fit these tail swipes into my deck? The problem.
That's the classic, how do I sideboard with Storm? It's like, well, you don't need to go as fast. Get these lotus petals out of here.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, so much for listening, and we'll see you all next week with another episode of Constructed Criticism.